Okay, so we should be live on Facebook. Welcome everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Misinterpretation, and I'm the Executive Director of Answers in Genesis in the UK. And I'm just going to check my phone, make sure we're live and up and running. So I'll just take one minute to do that. Great, there we go. We're up and running and everything's live and we've got people joining us, so that's really good. And so welcome. If you are joining us tonight, it's good to have you with us. And we have another special guest with us tonight who has joined us a few times before over the last few months, Dr. Terry Mortenson. And Terry will be speaking tonight on deep time evolutionism, an anti-biblical philosophy masquerading as science. This is a really helpful talk, so please do share it and like it on Facebook. Get this message out as far and wide as possible. I'll just give a brief introduction to Terry. Terry is a speaker in the US for Answers in Genesis, and he has an MDiv from Trinity Theological Seminary in the US, as well as a PhD in the history of geology from the UK, from Coventry University. So he knows what life is in the UK. He spent many years in Eastern Europe as a missionary, and I think also as a missionary for Campus Crusade. Is that right, Terry?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's great to have Terry with us. He's got a great knowledge of this whole issue of the importance of creation and evolution. So Terry, I'm going to hand over to you, and thanks for being with us again tonight.
Well, it's great to be with you again, Simon, and greetings to those of you in the UK and everywhere else you might be listening. So, deep time evolutionism, anti-biblical philosophy masquerading as science. Why isn't this forwarding? Davis Young is a leading Christian geologist in the United States, professor emeritus of geology at Calvin College in the United States. And he said, if rocks are historical documents, we are driven to the related conclusion that the available evidence is overwhelmingly opposed to the notion that the Noahic flood deposited rocks of the Colorado Plateau only a few thousand years ago. The Christian who believes that the idea of an ancient earth is unbiblical would do better to deny the validity of any kind of historical geology and insist that the rocks must be the product of pure miracle rather than try to explain them in terms of the Noahic flood. An examination of the earth apart from ideological presuppositions is bound to lead to the conclusion that it is ancient, by which he means billions of years. Well, we could summarize that statement by saying the facts speak for themselves. The rocks and the fossils are screaming millions of years. What we see in living creatures is screaming evolution, that one kind of creature evolved into a different kind of creature, that stars and galaxies evolved over billions of years of cosmic evolution. All of this is scientific fact, and it doesn't have anything to do with presuppositions. And that kind of thinking has really captured the world and captured much of the church. And many theologians have been influenced by Davis Young's writings. For example, James Montgomery Boyce, a very famous Presbyterian pastor in Philadelphia, he said, we have to admit here that the exegetical basis of the creationists is strong. In other words, he's saying, young earth creationists who argue for 6 literal days and a young earth, just from the biblical text, they got a strong case. But he says, in spite of the careful biblical and scientific research that has accumulated in support of the creationist view, there are problems that make the theory wrong to most, including many evangelical scientists. And what is the problem? Data from various disciplines point to a very old earth and an older universe. No, what I want to show you is it's not the data. It's the interpretation of the data, and the interpretations have been done based on certain philosophical, non-scientific assumptions. Another famous Bible scholar here in the United States who passed away a number of years ago, Gleason Archer, Old Testament professor. From a superficial reading of Genesis 1, the impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. He didn't believe that. He believed in the day-age view. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, this seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates that the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. Well, no, it was not the scientific research. As I'm going to argue, it's the anti-biblical assumptions that have been used to interpret some of the evidence that has been gleaned from scientific research. Another one, Bruce Waltke, one of the most influential Old Testament scholars today. The days of creation may also pose difficulties for a strict historical account. Contemporary scientists almost unanimously discount the possibility of creation in 1 week, and we cannot summarily discount the evidence of the earth sciences. Well, no, it's not the evidence, it's the interpretation of the evidence based on assumptions. And creationists don't summarily discount the evidence, they discount it as a result of careful investigation of the assumptions and careful observation of the actual geological evidence. C. John Collins, another famous Old Testament professor at Covenant Seminary in America in St. Louis, in his book, Science and Faith, Friends or Foes, in which he argues for something like the day-age view. He calls it the analogical day view. I conclude then that I have no reason to disbelieve the standard theories of the geologists, including their estimate for the age of the earth. They may be wrong for all I know, but if they are wrong, it's not because they have improperly smuggled philosophical assumptions into their work. Well, what I'm going to show you is that's exactly what the geologists have done. Millard Erickson, at the present, the view which I find most satisfactory is a variation of the day-age theory. There are too many exegetical difficulties attached to the gap theory, trying to put the millions of years between verse 1 and 2 of Genesis 1, while the flood theory involves too great a strain upon the geological evidence. No, it's the anti-biblical assumptions that are being used to interpret that evidence. A couple more, I just want to drive home this point of how much our evangelical theologians and Bible scholars have been captured by this false narrative that scientists just go out and let the facts speak for themselves. Gordon Lewis and Bruce Demarest at Denver Seminary, very influential. They hold to the day-age view, concluding that ultimately, responsible geology must determine the length of the Genesis days. Now, wait a minute. I thought responsible Bible study, careful attention to the biblical text, comparing scripture with scripture is the way that we determine the meaning of any portion of scripture. Why should we let responsible geology determine the meaning of the biblical text? And what do they mean by responsible geology? Well, obviously they mean whatever the majority of geologists say. Wayne Grudem was one of my favorite professors in seminary. His systematic theology text has been translated into 12 major languages, and they're working, I think, on 6 more languages. And he says in that systematic theology, although our conclusions are tentative at this point in our understanding, scripture seems to be more easily understood to suggest, but not to require, the young earth view, while the observable facts of creation seem to increasingly favor an old earth view. No, it's not the observable facts. Geologists don't go out and look at rocks and fossils and say, oh, wow, millions of years. So this is what we're told. This is what the scientific community has convinced, the scientific majority has convinced the world of, including most evangelical Bible scholars. The scientists go out and look at the world, whether it's stars and planets and galaxies or rock layers and fossils or living creatures, and they say, it all points to millions of years and evolution. Only someone who refuses to look at the facts will deny that conclusion. And the scientific community is doing a very good job convincing people of that. The American Association for the Advancement of Science is the leading science organization in America. And they recently have developed a program called Dialogue on Science and Ethics and Religion, building on the AAAS's longstanding commitment to relate scientific knowledge and technological development to the purposes and concerns of society at large. The Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion facilitates communication between scientific and religious communities. And so they're trying to influence religious communities, and they have established a program that they call Science for Seminaries. Now, you can be certain that as they offer scientists to come into the seminaries to help educate them on matters of science, they're not going into the seminaries to teach seminary students about water being made up of H2O and gravity, and they're not talking to them about how animals reproduce. They're talking to them about evolution and millions of years. That's what they want to influence the seminaries to accept. BioLogos in America is the leading promoter of theistic evolution. It was founded by Francis Collins, who was the head of the Human Genome Project and still is the leader of the National Institutes of Health in America, in the federal government. And they believe completely in the Big Bang, the billions of years, biological evolution, human evolution. They believe that's the process God used to create. And they are influencing the church. And they have a booth at the Evangelical Theological Society every year, trying to influence professors. In 2016, they signed a multi-year contract for a series of books with InterVarsity Press to promote theistic evolution in the church. But InterVarsity Press is only one of many evangelical publishers today in America and in other countries that are promoting theistic evolution in the church. And the two books in the middle, Adam and the Genome and Evolution, Scripture, and Nature Say Yes, both of those books deny that there ever was a literal historical Adam and Eve. So the church is being influenced greatly to accept this notion that the scientific majority has simply gone out and looked at the facts, and the facts say evolution and millions of years. But now we want to consider, what do the secularists say about the nature of the origins debate? And I want to quote from a news article that appeared in the Boston Globe, one of our leading American newspapers. And the author says, while scientists and creationists often square off over the scientific evidence for evolution, the source of the ongoing dispute is deeper. Well, before we look at what the deeper issue is, notice something in the highlighted words: scientists and creationists. What does that tell the reader? Well, it's sending a subtle message that creationists are not scientists. They're anti-science. The scientists are against the anti-scientists. But that's really not what the dispute is about. The article goes on to quote Michael Ruse, who's an atheist philosopher and evolutionist. He says, "This is not just a fight about dinosaurs or gaps in the fossil record," says Michael Ruse, speaking from his home in Florida. "This is a fight about different worldviews." And this is one of the places where I totally agree with this atheist. This is a battle about worldviews. James Secord is a very prominent historian of geology, writing about some geological controversies in the early 19th century when the whole idea of millions of years was being developed, and the geological record with different formations were being identified. He says, most significantly, recent work in cultural anthropology and the sociology of knowledge has shown that the conceptual framework that brings the natural world into a comprehensible form becomes especially evident when a scientist constructs a classification. In this case, he's talking about a rock formation. Previous experience, early training, institutional loyalties, personal temperament, and theoretical outlook are all brought to bear in defining particular boundaries as natural. In other words, he's saying, when they go out and look at, let's say, a limestone layer or a sandstone layer, when they look at the White Cliffs of Dover, for example, and they're trying to figure out what the geological history of that huge formation is, they're not just looking at the rocks and the fossils. Their previous experience before they ever saw the rocks and fossils, their early training, their loyalties to whatever institution they're associated with. And most importantly, I would argue, their theoretical outlook. That's another way of saying their worldview will be brought to bear, will influence, will even control their interpretation of the evidence. Now let's go back to the 19th century, actually the late 18th century. James Hutton is considered by many geologists essentially the father of modern geology. He helped to develop the idea of millions of years of Earth history. And he said this: the past history of our globe must be explained. Okay, so he's going to lay down a principle, a law of geological reasoning. If we're going to reconstruct the past history of our Earth, he said, it must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. No powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe. No action to be admitted except those of which we know the principle. So he said, if we're going to interpret the geological evidence of rock layers and fossils, we must limit our explanations to present natural processes, things we see happening now and that are natural. Well, what has he ruled out by that kind of reasoning? He's ruled out creation, because creation wasn't happening when he wrote that sentence, and creation wasn't natural. It was supernatural. God calling things into existence by his word, Genesis 1 tells us. Supernatural creation. What else has he ruled out in his thinking before he's ever looked at the rocks? He's ruled out Noah's flood, because Noah's flood wasn't happening when he wrote that sentence, and Noah's flood was not a natural event. Well, it was natural in the sense that water flowed downhill in Noah's flood, just like water flows downhill today, and moving water eroded and carried sediments, just like moving water does today. But the flood wasn't simply a natural event. It was supernatural. It was a divine judgment. Natural things were happening, but God triggered that, initiated that event, and brought it to an end. Charles Lyell was born the year that Hutton died, and Lyell built his thinking on Hutton's ideas. And he wrote once in a private letter to one of his fellow evolutionary geologists that he wanted to free the science of geology from Moses. Now, isn't that a strange statement? What does he have against Moses? Well, he wants to silence God's eyewitness testimony. You see, the Bible is not just written by men. It is the word of God. And God was there and observing every event that is recorded in the Bible. And so the Bible is God's eyewitness testimony. And by freeing the science of geology from Moses, he wanted to free geology from the constraints of the biblical worldview and the biblical history given in Genesis. Now, when Charles Lyell went on his famous 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle beginning in 1831, he took a copy of Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, on the boat with him. And years later, after he came back from that trip, he said in a private letter in 1844, I always feel as if my books came half out of Lyell's brains, and that I never acknowledged this sufficiently. nor do I know how I can without saying so in so many words. For I've always thought that the great merit of the Principles of Geology, which Lyell wrote, was that it altered the whole tone of one's mind, and therefore when seeing a thing never seen by Lyell, one yet saw it through his eyes. So when Darwin went out into the world, he was first looking at rocks and fossils, and then later the question of the origin of living things. And he was influenced, his mind was shaped by the thinking of Charles Lyell, whose mind was influenced by the thinking of James Hutton. They were influenced by a naturalistic worldview. Another famous American historian writing about the history of geology said in a book review about Darwin and the problem of creation, Gillespie, who wrote that book, shows the theological considerations played a major role in the biological science of Darwin's day, including Darwin's. He was influenced by theological considerations, not biblical ones, a different theology. And from this, Gillespie argues that the reason there is so much theology in the book Origin of Species is that the theological issues were still live ones for Darwin, and more important, that special creation was a living and powerful idea among his professional colleagues, one that required him to attack it with whatever weapons would be effective, including ridicule. Darwin was not opposing the teaching of special creation that comes from the Bible by scientific facts. He was attacking it by ridicule, by philosophy, by a different theological construct, by a different worldview that was hidden from his readers, except those readers who were discerning and had a biblical worldview. Stephen Gould and Niles Eldredge, two leading evolutionists of the 20th century, said this: as an a priori bias, phyletic gradualism, that is Darwin's theory of slow gradual evolution, has precluded any fair assessment of evolutionary tempos and modes. It could not be refuted by empirical catalogs constructed in its light because it excluded concrete information as the artificial result of an imperfect fossil record. In other words, Darwin said, well, the fossil record doesn't really support my theory, but that's because we haven't found enough fossils. And so the theory stood because he could just say, well, we don't have enough fossils. These two evolutionists say phyletic gradualism was an a priori assertion from the start. In other words, it was an assertion before Darwin ever looked at the evidence. In fact, Darwin was influenced by evolutionary ideas from his grandfather and from men that he socialized with and intellectually interacted with up in Edinburgh before he went to Cambridge to study. This assertion was never seen in the rocks, these two evolutionists say. It expressed the cultural and political biases of the 19th century liberalism. So here's what happened in the late 18th and early 19th century. Two secular starting points began to take control, first of geology, then through Darwin, biology, and then astronomy and all the other sciences in the 20th century. The first starting point of this naturalistic worldview is that nature is all that exists. Not every scientist believes that, but most scientists do their work as if that's true. So belief in God is part of their private life, not part of their scientific work. The second assumption is that everything can and indeed must be explained by three things: time plus chance plus the laws of nature working on matter. If you have those three things, time, enough of it, millions and billions of years, chance, and the laws of nature, you can explain the origin of rock layers and fossils, the origin of living creatures, the origin of stars and galaxies and planets. Those are the assumptions that took control of science, first in geology over 200 years ago. They are the assumptions of the philosophy of naturalism, or they're also known by another name. Those are the assumptions of the religion of atheism. And atheism today controls science all over the world. Not all scientists are atheists, but atheism controls how scientists think. And another prominent atheist evolutionist is Richard Lewontin at Harvard University. He expresses it this way: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. Now, see, again, right in his language, he's defining science as naturalistic in opposition to supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdities of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories like non-living chemicals evolved into the first living, reproducing, single-celled creature, or stories like a fish walked out onto the land and became the first amphibian, or a reptile jumped out of a tree and eventually became the first bird, or an ape eventually evolved into a human. These unsubstantiated stories, in spite of the fact that they don't have scientific support, we accept them because we have an a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. In other words, a commitment to a philosophy of materialism or atheism or naturalism before we ever look at the evidence. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material, natural explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. We can't allow God in our thinking. Okay, let's apply this. What he's really saying in different words is we can't invoke an intelligent creator to explain the origin of living creatures or the origin of the solar system or stars and galaxies or rock layers and fossils. Well, I've never met Richard Lewontin, but I am absolutely certain that he does not think that Mount Rushmore is the result of time and chance and the laws of nature. He wouldn't come to this scene in South Dakota with an a priori commitment. Well, no matter what I see, I have to explain this naturally by nature, wind and rain blowing dust onto the rocks to carve these faces. No, everyone knows those are the result of creative intelligence. Really smart people who knew how to use dynamite, jackhammers, and chisels to carve those faces. Richard Lewontin would not see these objects and say, isn't it amazing what time and chance and the laws of nature produced? Or maybe a hurricane or a tornado blowing through a junkyard. No, they're the result of creative intelligence. And we can see that they actually understand this principle. Evolutionists do. They've developed a whole series of radio telescopes in their search for extraterrestrial life. What are they doing? Well, they're listening to outer space, and they're trying to listen for sounds. And if they hear a sequence of sounds that doesn't sound like random noise, that sounds like there's some kind of structure and complexity to the order of the sounds, they will conclude, aha, this is sign of an alien civilization trying to communicate, because complex, ordered structure points to intelligence. They've never heard any sounds like that. All they hear is random noise, but they keep searching. But then we come to things like these living creatures, and the evolutionists want us to believe and insist that it is a scientific fact that they are the result of nothing more than time plus chance plus the laws of nature working on matter. They can't explain scientifically where the laws of nature came from, but they're just saying by natural processes, chemical and physical processes, gravity, the laws of genetics, the laws of chemistry and physics, we can explain how these creatures came into existence. Not only how an elephant came from another elephant, but how the first elephant came into existence from something that was not an elephant, and how all those creatures are related to a single-celled creature which popped into existence in the primordial oceans 3.5 billion years ago. But is that really true? And is that really science? Well, a little more evidence of the philosophical and worldview influence on science. In 1998, a survey was done of 517 members of the National Academy of Sciences in America, the highest scientific body, and 50% of the people responded to this. They were from the hard sciences. So they were the scientists in mathematics and physics and biology and chemistry and genetics. And of the 50% who responded, 72% were overtly atheist. 20% were agnostic, which means they're practical atheists. Only 7% believed in a personal God, but that doesn't mean they were Christians. They could have been Muslims, Jews, or just believing in some vague concept of God. And the fact that the other 50% didn't respond, I think would indicate they were all unbelievers, because I think believers would have wanted to register their presence in the National Academy of Sciences. And so the conclusion is that the National Academy of Sciences is extremely anti-biblical in its orientation. And this was a survey that duplicated a survey that was done at the beginning of the 20th century. I think it was about 1904. And the statistical results were exactly the same, which tells us that the National Academy of Sciences hasn't changed in a whole century, which is understandable because it's self-perpetuating. The only way a scientist gets into the National Academy of Science is if existing members vote them in. So what we need to understand, and what most Christians don't understand, is that assumptions are critical to the process of observing the creation and interpreting it and reconstructing the past. Nobody looks at the world with an empty mind, and those assumptions affect what they see and how they interpret what they see. If they start with anti-biblical assumptions, they come up with the idea of evolution in millions of years. That is historically exactly where that idea, those two ideas came from. But scientists back in the 17th, 18th, 19th century who had a biblical worldview looked at the world and saw evidence of creation, and scientists in the last 200 years who have a biblical worldview see all kinds of evidence that confirms what Genesis says. So that's all kind of theoretical. Let's look at these assumptions at work with some examples. Stephen Jay Gould, as I've quoted before, one of America's most famous evolutionists. He was an atheist Jew until his death. He said this: the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. This lack of fossil evidence for gradual evolution is what led Gould and others to propose a theory of punctuated equilibrium, that evolution happens very rapidly in small populations. And because it happens so rapidly, there's no time for fossil evidence to develop. Ernst Mayr, also at Harvard University, died at the age of 100, one of America's greatest evolutionists. He said, given the fact of evolution, one would expect the fossils to document a gradual, steady change from ancestral forms to descendants. But this is not what the paleontologist finds. Instead, he or she finds gaps in just about every phyletic series. The discovery of unbroken series of species changing gradually into descending species is very rare. Gould again adds to this. We have direct evidence of large-scale changes based on sequences in the fossil record. Okay, he's already said that the evidence is very rare, but now he's going to say we do have direct evidence of large-scale changes. The nature of this evidence, however, he says, is often misunderstood by non-professionals, lay people, theologians, who view evolution as a simple ladder of progress and therefore expect a linear array of missing links. A linear array of missing links. He said that's not the way it is. Well, why has the public misunderstood this? Why have the non-professionals, theologians, teenagers, lay people, professors in other fields outside of the hard sciences, why have they gotten this impression? Well, because the evolutionists, they have charts like this, an exhibit at the Natural History Museum at the University of Michigan in America, showing whale evolution. It's a line of descent. Or this one from the website of the University of California, Berkeley, one of our prominent universities, showing horse evolution. And the arrow, the linear evolution, is on their diagram. Or this one in a prominent biology textbook used in the United States, showing the linear evolution from a little creature into eventually a camel. Or these famous pictures that we've all seen of human evolution. It's a linear, step-by-step process of evolution. So the fact that the public gets this impression is not because we've misunderstood, it's because we've understood exactly what the evolutionists have been brainwashing us with through their diagrams. But Gould then goes on to the quote that I just read. He says, but evolution is a copiously branching bush, not a ladder. It's not a linear process of change. Since our fossil record is so imperfect, he's using the same excuse that Darwin used. We can't hope to find evidence for every twiglet. Sometimes we do discover an entire little bush, but such examples are as rare as they are precious. In the usual case, okay, so he's told us we don't find the evolutionary tree. The branches are exceedingly rare. We sometimes find a little bush so we can see that some creatures are connected, but that's even rare. What's the usual case? Well, he tells us, we may discover the remains of side branch 5 from the bush's early history, then bough 40 a bit later, then the full series of branches, 156 to 161 in a well-preserved sequence of younger rocks, and finally, surviving twigs 250 and 287. Well, let's illustrate what he says. Such sequences provide superb examples of temporally ordered evolutionary trends. Consider the evidence for human evolution in Africa. Well, we don't have time to go into that. If you can get my lecture on Ape Men, the Grand Illusion, you'll see that we don't have that evolutionary tree of human origins like he's suggesting. But let's go on and consider some more of his illustration. But I also want to mention that just recently on Facebook and YouTube, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson presented 25 presentations on his cutting edge research in genetics, confirming that Genesis 1 is confirmed by genetics. Genesis 1 to 11, the biblical timescale, creation about 6,000 years ago, the flood about 4,500 years ago. A very exciting and and fascinating series of presentations, illustrated presentations. You can watch it all on Answers TV, and you can find a link for that on our website. But let's go back to Dr. Gould's illustration. He said, the rare cases, we might find twiglet number 5 and then a branch 40 and a branch 150 and these others. And then we might find kind of a whole bush. But he's assuming that from that evidence, which is very skimpy if you think about it, at least 261 branches and all we have is about 10. He's assuming that they're all related to a common ancestor. But that's an assumption based on evolutionary naturalistic thinking. He's assuming these big branches, but he's already told us in a quote that I read earlier, we don't have branches. We don't have fossil evidence for the branches. And so it's just as valid, and I think the scientific evidence shows it's even more valid to say those are not all connected. Those are different kinds of creatures. Well, let's look at another concrete example. This was a famous skull found in 1972. It was a labeled skull KNMER 1470. It was found in Kenya. Kenya National Museum has the fossil. It was originally dated by nearby volcanic tuff to be 2.6 million years old. But that was not acceptable to most of the scientific community because the skull was too human-like. And so there was a lot of pressure on the discoverers to say, you need to redate that. And so over the next 10 years, there were that tuff, volcanic tuff was dated using 4 different methods, producing results that range from 500,000 to 17.5 million years. Well, now, what's the correct age? The methods are giving us all different dates. Well, those methods are based on those naturalistic assumptions, those dating methods are. So what's the correct age? Well, after 10 years of controversy back and forth and dating methods, they finally concluded that the fossil was 1.9 million years old, not on the basis of radiometric dating, but on the basis of nearby pig fossils. Well, how did they date those? Well, not by radiometric dating. Assumptions are controlling the dating methods. Here's a statement by John Reeder, leading evolutionist. More fundamentally, writing about the dating of this fossil, the dating controversy over 10 years shows that modern paleoanthropologists are no less likely to cling to erroneous data that supports their preconceptions, it's another word for assumptions, than were earlier investigators. Dubois and the missing link, Leakey and the oldest man, both dismissed objective assessment in favor of the notions they wanted to believe. You see the power of assumptions, the power of presuppositions controlling the interpretation of the evidence. Or let's consider another example. Phil Gingrich is a professor at the University of Michigan. He's an expert on whale fossils. And in 1983, he published an article in the Journal of Geological Education for teachers to read so they'd know what to teach their students. And he had evidence of whale evolution. And he had the picture, and you can see that creature is part land animal, part sea creature. And he said, he called it Pakicetus because he found the bones in Pakistan, and cetus is Latin for whale. Pakicetus is the oldest and most primitive whale yet discovered. It is an important transitional form linking Paleocene carnivorous land mammals and later more advanced marine whales. He said it is. Notice the verbs. It is. Well, what was the fossil evidence for that? He tells us in the article, he shows us. It was the head. No, it was not the head. It was only the shaded parts of the head. He had no fossil evidence below the head. And yet, in the picture, he could draw the rear end of the creature. Well, that was 1983. He kept digging there in Pakistan, and by 2001, they had found more fossil evidence. They had almost a complete skeleton. And in a technical article published in Great Britain in Nature, they had a technical description of the fossil evidence, a picture of the fossil evidence. And I found two different evolutionist websites that have pictures of what the evolutionists think that fossil skeleton looked like when it had muscles and skin. And that's Pakicetus, which is just about exactly like Dr. Gingrich's 1983 picture, isn't it? No, hardly. This creature was no more amphibious, the technical article in Nature said, was no more amphibious than a tapir, which is a land-based pig-like creature. Well, Phil Gingrich said, in time and in its morphology, Pakicetus is perfectly intermediate, a missing link between earlier land mammals and later more full-fledged whales. He said that in 1994. He found the skull in 1983. He said it was a transitional form. In 1994, he says it's a transitional form. In 2001, in a technical article, not for the general public, we're told, oh no, it wasn't a half whale, half land animal. It was a 100% land animal. He said, science emerged, in the article I just quoted, science emerged from a philosophically motivated inquiry into the nature of our world, and it has usurped some of the mystery formerly included in religion. He admits that it's philosophical ideas that are controlling the interpretation of the physical evidence that scientists study. Prior to that, the biblical worldview, the biblical history in Genesis was guiding the scientific investigations. Now it was an anti-biblical, atheistic worldview. So we go back to this exhibit, which is at Dr. Gingrich's museum. He also did research on Rhodocetus and showing it as part land animal, part sea creature. It's got legs, but it's got sort of like flippers, and it's got not a land animal tail, it's got a fluke. Well, Dr. Carl Werner produced a book as a result of going around the world to 60 of the leading natural history museums and photographing the fossil evidence and interviewing the leading paleontologists. He went to the University of Michigan Natural History Museum. He interviewed Dr. Gingrich, and in the interview, he found out that fluke that was in the diagram, Dr. Gingrich admitted he didn't have any fossil evidence for the fluke, for the tail. He said, I speculated that it might have had a fluke. I now, talking to Dr. Werner in 2007, I now doubt that Rhodocetus had a fluke tail. But what about those semi-flipper type arms and legs? Well, Dr. Gingrich also admitted to Dr. Werner that initially when they found the fossil evidence, they didn't find any evidence for the so-called arms and legs. It was totally imagined for the museum display. When they found more, they realized they weren't flippers at all. So that diagram is completely false. And we could go through all the different 5 creatures there and show that that's a myth. This is the book and a DVD that goes with it that Dr. Werner produced. Beautiful full color photographs and quotes from these leading paleontologists at the major natural history museums of the world. Here's another example. National Geographic in 1999 had an article, Feathers for T-Rex, New Bird-like Fossils Are Missing Links in Dinosaur Evolution. Again, notice the verb, are, not might be, not could be, not we suggest. And look at that baby T-Rex. It looks like it's got down feathers. But that's just a painting. That's not a photograph. You open up the article and they've got a picture of this dino bird. And they say, we can now say that birds are theropods just as confidently as we say that humans are mammals. Well, what's a theropod? That's a theropod. And once you see that, you see there's a problem, because that dino bird has very, very long arms, whereas a theropod has very short arms compared to its legs. But they said, we're just as confident that birds are theropods as humans are mammals. Well, they said that in November of 1999. In March of 2000, just a few months later, National Geographic published an article with a letter to the editor. It was a letter to the editor by a Chinese paleontologist who said in so many words, the fossil on which you base that article was a fraud. Well, National Geographic had egg on their face. They had a fossil that was actually the parts of a bird fossil and parts of a reptile fossil very cleverly glued together, it turns out, by Chinese farmers. Well, National Geographic commissioned an independent investigator, and he wrote an article in October of 2000. So about a year after the first article was published. And it's a fascinating read. It's stuck in the back of the magazine. It doesn't have any beautiful full color pictures. And here was the conclusion of the author of how this fraud, how this hoax happened as he investigated. He said, it's a tale of misguided secrecy and misplaced confidence, of rampant egos clashing, self-aggrandizement, wishful thinking, naive assumptions, human error, stubbornness, manipulation, backbiting, lying, corruption, and most of all, abysmal communication. It's a story in which none of the characters look good. So again, I'm trying to help you see that scientists don't go out and look at the world and just let the rocks and the fossils speak for themselves, or just look at living creatures and say, oh, well, it's obvious they evolved from other kinds of creatures. Or look at stars and galaxies. Well, it's obvious they evolved from a gas cloud. No, it's not obvious. And when we see charts like this in museums or textbooks, picturing the history of life over millions of years, and the evolutionists say from the first living cell up to the present is 3.5 billion years. Well, how did that idea come about? Well, it was the result of Hutton and Lyell and others that I've just referred to back in the late 18th and early 19th century. And at that time, there were three competing views of Earth history. There was the biblical traditional view, defended by a group of authors called the scriptural geologists, who were the object of my PhD research. And they believed the Bible's account of history, that God was giving us true history. And so God created in a supernatural creation week of 6 literal days. He destroyed the world about 1600 years later by a global flood. And then the earth recovered from that event up to the present. And this whole period from the very beginning of creation to today was about 6,000 years. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, we had the catastrophist view of Cuvier in France and William Smith in England. They did believe in God, so they believed in a supernatural beginning. They did not believe in biological evolution. So they believed God created the first kinds of creatures. Life went along for a long period of time, and then there was a catastrophic flood, these men said, that was global or at least continental, and wiped out most or all of the creatures living at the time. Buried many of those creatures in sediments, and they became fossils. And these major catastrophic events happened every so often over the course of untold ages. They were clearly thinking millions of years. And then we had the view of Hutton and Lyell, which became known as the Uniformitarian view. And from their writings, we can't be sure if there was a supernatural, if they believed in a supernatural beginning. They might have been secret atheists, but on their timeline, no seas, no catastrophic floods of a continental or global scale, certainly not Noah's flood. And the earth is millions and millions of years old. Well, by about 1840, those first two views passed off the scene, and the uniformitarian view became the ruling view in geology. And everyone who went to the university to study geology was trained to think like Lyell and Hutton. Slow, gradual processes will explain everything that you see. Slow, gradual, particle at a time erosion, slow, gradual sedimentation, slow, gradual hardening of the rocks. And that was the way people were trained to think in geology. And that's the way geologists thought for the next 130 years, until the 1970s, when some evolutionary geologists began to reject that. And if you want to know more about the early 19th century, I have a lecture, Millions of Years, Where Did the Idea Come From, that will explain that. But in the 1970s, some evolutionary geologists began to go back to the early 19th century to the ideas of the catastrophists, and they became known as new catastrophists. And Derek Ager was a leading geologist in Britain, in Wales, at the university in Swansea. And in a book on the strata of the earth, he had been to over 50 countries. He wrote 4 books on geology, a couple hundred scientific papers on geology. Writing in a book to his fellow evolutionary geologists, he said this: "My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. In other words, we've allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes." So for 130 years or more, he's saying that geology departments at the universities were brainwashing students to exclude catastrophe from their thinking, to think only slow, gradual processes can be used to explain what I see. He said we were brainwashed. Well, let me illustrate brainwashing. Here you have 2 curved yellow lines. I've got a little quiz, a little exam for you. And the question is, what's missing? What was this picture originally? Was it A? Was it B? Was it C? Or was it D? And if I had a live audience, I could get you to raise your hand. Do you think it was A, B, C, or D? And usually people hesitate on the first 2, and then more say, well, maybe it was C. Most people say it was D. Well, let's see what the correct answer is. The correct answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Why do people think something is missing? Well, because I asked a question, what's missing? And they think, well, he wouldn't ask what's missing if something's not missing. So I've got to fit something into the picture. So I can control the way people think simply by putting a question into their heads. Well, let me show you another picture. This is a picture of an old lady, and she's looking out kind of to the towards the screen a little bit. You can see her big nose there, and she forgot to put her dentures in. You can see her left eye, and she's got a little growth on the right side of her nose, and you can barely see the eyelash of her right eye. I hope you can see that old lady. She's got a big warm fluffy thing up around her neck to keep her warm. Well, actually, that's not an old lady. That's a young lady. She's not looking out towards the screen. She's looking away from the screen. And what I said was a mouth is actually a little delicate necklace. And what I said was a nose is actually her left jaw. And what I said was her left ear, eye is actually her left ear. And that little thing that I said was some kind of growth is actually the tip of her nose. And what I said was her right eyelash is actually her left eyelash. She's looking into the screen. Now, which is it? Is it the old lady or is it the young lady? Well, it depends on what you're looking for. Now, please note, we all agree where the black lines and the black sections are and where the white spaces are. That's the facts. Nobody disagrees about the facts, but what's the correct interpretation of the fact? Well, in this case, there is no correct interpretation because the artist who made this, I think back in the 19th century sometime, intentionally did it this way to mess with our minds. But God didn't create the world and he didn't destroy the world in a global flood to mess with our minds. There is a correct interpretation. Well, here's a statement by a leading cosmologist. Big Bang cosmology is probably I got to look at the quote here. As widely believed as has been any theory of the universe in the history of Western civilization. It rests, however, this evolutionary cosmologist says, on many untested and in some cases untestable assumptions. Indeed, Big Bang cosmology has become a bandwagon of thought that reflects faith as much as objective truth. Not all scientists, not even all secular scientists accept the Big Bang theory today. And so, again, we go out, we see rock layers and fossils, we see stars and galaxies and planets, we see living creatures. If we start with anti-biblical assumptions that reject the eyewitness testimony of God in Scripture, we'll come up with ideas that are evolutionary over millions of years. But if we start with biblical assumptions and look at those same things, we actually see evidence that confirms the history in the Bible. And so the battle is not at the level of the scientific facts, the observations. The battle is at the level of the assumptions that are used to interpret the evidence. And for 200 years, most of science has been controlled by a naturalistic worldview, man deciding truth by himself. We picture those assumptions as a pair of glasses. And most scientists have rejected the word of God. They have rejected the eyewitness testimony of the Creator. Sadly, most Christians have also rejected what God's word says, and they have believed what the secular scientists say. And so they're wearing those glasses. They're either biblical glasses or evolutionized glasses. And as we've been pointing out, the glasses represent assumptions that are in the minds of most scientists, that nature is all that exists and that everything can be explained by time and chance and the laws of nature. But biblical creationists don't accept those assumptions. And they have two basic biblical starting points: that the eternal, good, all-knowing, all-powerful, holy God exists and he created everything else. That's a very different starting assumption than nature is all that exists. And the second assumption is that the Bible is God's completely truthful eyewitness testimony, which reveals the key events in history so that we can correctly interpret the evidence from the history of the creation. And so from that history in the Bible, we have what we call the 7 C's of history. Creation, which explains why we have a world with amazing plants and animals and people. And corruption, which explains why we live in a world with disease and death and things like COVID-19. The fall of Adam and Eve in sin brought the judgment of God on the whole creation. And then catastrophe, Noah's flood, which explains why we live on an earth covered with thousands of feet of sedimentary rocks containing billions of dead things. And then confusion, the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, which explains why we live in a world with lots of different people groups with different languages, and those people groups have distinctive physical characteristics: very dark brown skin, medium brown skin, light brown skin, very superficial differences. And then Christ came into the world to solve the problem that started in the garden. And he did so through his death on the cross and his resurrection. And one day he's coming again to consummate history, to bring an end to all the death and the suffering. and create a new heavens and a new earth. So two different views of looking at the world: God's word or a naturalistic worldview. And modern geologists would argue that Lyell's view has largely prevailed. They would tell you that their science represents the total triumph of Lyell's uniformity over unscientific catastrophism. But Dr. Gould says Lyell's view, he was a lawyer. And his book, Principles of Geology, 3 volumes, was one of the most brilliant briefs ever published by an advocate. Lyell relied on true bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. First, he set up a straw man to demolish. In fact, the early 19th century catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. And I would say the scriptural geologists were more empirically minded than the old earth catastrophists. The geological record does seem to require catastrophes, Dr. Gould says. Rocks are fractured and contorted. Whole faunas are wiped out. To circumvent this literal appearance, Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence. But gradualism was never proved from the rocks by Lyell or Darwin, but was rather imposed as a bias upon nature. It has had a profoundly negative impact on stifling hypotheses and closing the minds of a profession toward reasonable empirical alternatives to the dogma of gradualism. Lyell won with rhetoric what he could not carry with data. And finally, Gould goes on to say, our ways of learning about the world are strongly influenced by social preconceptions and biased modes of thinking, today dominated by anti-biblical modes of thinking, that each scientist must apply to any problem. The stereotype of a fully rational and objective scientific method, which individual scientists as logical and interchangeable robots, is self-serving mythology. And back to Derek Ager, that 20th century geologist in Wales. Perhaps I'm becoming a cynic in my old age, but I cannot help thinking that people find things that they expect to find. As Sir Edward Bailey said, to find a thing, you have to believe it to be possible. Well, modern geologists today have a number of impossible beliefs. They believe it's impossible that the Bible is the inspired word of the Creator and that Genesis 1-11 is accurate history. They believe it's impossible that God supernaturally created distinct kinds of plants and animals with the potential for great variation within their kind. They think it's impossible to believe that creation week was 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago, and they think it's impossible to believe that Noah's flood was global, year-long, and unimaginably catastrophic. They think those things are impossible, but they think that not because of facts, not because of rocks and fossils or DNA or stars and galaxies. They think it's impossible for spiritual and moral reasons. They don't want to believe that a creator made the world and therefore made them. Well, let me wrap things up with an example of a key but false evolutionist assumption. Here's the assumption. The absence of fossils of a creature in a particular geological formation is evidence of the non-existence of that creature when that sedimentary layer was deposited. That's a long ways to say what I could say more simply. The key assumption that I'm going to show you that's false is the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Look, the rock record must have formed millions of years before man because we don't see man down in the lower rock layers. The absence of evidence of human fossils is proof that the humans didn't exist at the time those layers were formed. Now, I'm not going to show you that this absolutely fundamental assumption controlling geology and evolutionary biology and paleontology is false. So you have this supposed geological record showing evolution. And they say, look, humans never lived with dinosaurs because there are no human fossils with dinosaurs. And we don't have any living dinosaurs today. And they say that the last highest layer where there's dinosaurs was 65 million years ago, and there are no human or dinosaur fossils. So that's proof positive that dinosaurs never lived with humans. Or they say the coelacanth went extinct 65 million years ago with the dinosaurs. And 65 million years of supposed rocks, no coelacanth fossils, so they went extinct. But then in 1983, they found the coelacanth swimming off the coast of Madagascar in about 400 feet of water, and it's virtually identical to the fossil. So the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. No evolutionist believes that the coelacanth evolved back into existence after 65 million years of extinction. And recently they found the coelacanth in a rock layer that they say is 17 million years old. Or we could talk about the Wallamai pine, supposedly went extinct 150 million years ago, but it was discovered alive, virtually unchanged, no evolution, in 1994. I could give you a lot more examples of these creatures that were thought to have gone extinct millions of years ago and then found alive. In fact, they're sometimes called Lazarus taxon because they've come back to life in a sense. 11 million years for this creature thought to have gone extinct. Or these ants, 15 to 20 million years ago, found alive in 2006. A tree that supposedly was extinct 200 million years ago, found alive, unchanged. A rock rat, 11 million years ago, extinct, but now alive. A horseshoe crab. So sometimes we see that there's no evidence above, and they say it's extinction. In the case of the horseshoe crab, it was from a rock 190 million years old. It looks just like the horseshoe crabs on the ocean floor today. But then they used to say that the horseshoe crab evolved 345 million years ago because that was the lowest layer where they found the horseshoe crab. They said that until it was found in a lower layer. So the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and they have to keep changing their theory of when the creature evolved into existence or when it went extinct. So the earliest horseshoe crab at one time was in the Mississippian deposits. Then they found a new horseshoe crab lower down over 100 million years earlier. Ernst Mayr, I quoted earlier, he said the fossil record of the earliest plants is very poor. Fossils of mosses, generally considered the most primitive of the living land plants, have been found from the Devonian period, but surely they existed earlier but did not fossilize. Now, wait a minute. If we don't have fossil evidence, how do you know they surely existed earlier, Dr. Mayr? So he said the earliest moss fossils are here in the Devonian, but he says below that we don't have any moss fossils, but he said they surely existed. Why? Not because we have fossil evidence, but because the theory of evolution requires it. Now, Dr. Mayr is dead, but if he was alive and I could go and talk to him, I would say, now, Dr. Mayr, the earliest human fossils are way up here at the top of the geological record. But I know, even though there were no human fossils in those lower layers, I know they existed because God says that man was created on the sixth day of history. And it says that there was a global flood, and those rock layers really were formed after Noah's flood. And he would say, oh, no, you can't say that because the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. But wait a minute, Dr. Mayr, if you can argue from the absence of evidence for plant evolution, why can't I argue that the absence of evidence doesn't prove anything about human origin? The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And so the theory of evolution is biological evolution, geological evolution, cosmological evolution. It's all a myth. And evolutionists talk about the evolution of stars and galaxies, and they talk about the evolution of the earth. Geological evolution is evolution. Biological evolution is evolution. Cosmological evolution is evolution. It's all based on naturalism, that everything can be explained by time and chance and the laws of nature. And that's a myth. But because most Christians and most non-Christians and most theologians don't understand that science is controlled by philosophical assumptions masquerading as scientific fact, they reject what Genesis says about the creation of the world. And they think that the observable facts point to millions of years. And so these men, leading theologians and a philosopher in the United States, they've endorsed this book saying that the earth is millions of years old and Noah's flood has nothing to do with the geological record. And so I'm going to wrap things up by just summarizing here. Scientists were not there at the beginning. They don't know everything. They don't always tell the truth. They make mistakes frequently. And most of them are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. They have rejected the word of the Creator. But God was there at the beginning. He knows everything. He always tells the truth. He never makes mistakes. And He loves us and He wants us to know the truth, which will set us free. So we need to understand the battle that we're in. It's a battle of ideas. It's a battle of worldviews. It's not facts against belief. It's worldview beliefs that are controlling the interpretation of the evidence, that are blinding people from seeing what the evidence really is screaming, which is that God's word is true. And so we need to look at that evidence in light of the scriptures, and we need to be ready to make a defense, Paul says, for the faith that we have. And so there are a lot of resources on the Answers in Genesis website, and Simon can point you to many, but I'll just point to a few that are really helpful. The Lie by Ken Ham, the founder and president of Answers in Genesis, explains in very simple terms why the church cannot compromise with evolution in millions of years. And it explains why the whole Western world is collapsing into moral anarchy and spiritual darkness. And a lecture that I've given, Biblical Creation, explains why the church cannot compromise with those millions of years, and explains what's wrong with the gap theory, the day-age view, the framework hypothesis, and other older views in the church today. And then 4 books that are really, really helpful, answering 130 of the most asked questions. Where did Cain get his wife? Where did the so-called races of people come from? There's really only one race, Adam's race. But how do we explain the diversity that we see in the human family? And what about radiometric dating? And how do we make sense of dinosaurs? And was the flood global? And what about natural selection and mutations? Do they prove evolution? And so these are tremendous resources. Each chapter is on a different question, and I highly recommend those to you. We've got books and DVDs dealing with the geological evidence, the biological evidence, astronomy, and I encourage you to check out our resources on our website. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Terry, for that brilliant presentation. Really benefit from that. And do, folks, as you remember, to share it with your friends, it out as much as possible. As Terry showed you, this issue has nothing to do with science, but is to do with philosophical assumptions that have been smuggled in. So really thankful for your, and I do pray that this will bless many people as they will. So thank you all for watching, and good night, and God bless.